when you read articles on Medium, 90% of the time it's clear that this person is putting together 2 sentences of content and stretching it out into a page and a half
I
to
know
get
what
you
you
to click.
Yeah.
And in your case, it was a book of content that was consolidated to about 10 pages. And I was sitting there going, I wish I'd have read an article like this when I started my weight training, and it would have saved me a lot of time and
No, I
effort.
appreciate that.
Yeah, man. Well, it's from the heart.
Hi, I'm Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Chasing Energy. Today's guest is Demont. Demont has a site called House of Hypertrophy. He posts articles to Medium, and he also has YouTube videos that are mostly animated. I asked him to be on this podcast after reading a few of his articles because I was really impressed by the amount of science that he put into evaluating different types of routines. Now, if you're somebody who's interested in getting the best use of your time when it comes to strength training, I highly recommend you look up his page, House of Hypertrophy. I've got a link in the show notes to his Kindle book, and you can look him up on YouTube or Medium. Any of those things are going to give you great content. His stuff is very concise and to the point, and it tests different variables in each one of his articles. And in fact, I'm actually testing right now one of the variables that he goes over, which is something called 3x7 training. Now, 3x7 training is, we don't talk about it in this interview, but I just wanted to share this is something I've been experimenting with, and it really, what's the word I'm looking for here? It really shocked my training in the sense that it pushed me to a new level. I'd kind of gotten comfortable with my weight training routine, was looking for something that's kind of spice it up. 3x7 is very simple, and I should probably do a podcast on it, but you end up doing 4 sets, and each set goes from 3 reps to 7 reps, and it's a certain amount of resistance. And they found that people who do these workouts have very good muscle growth. It's also very fast. I will warn you, it's very painful and intense. So if that intimidates you, it's not the workout for you. If you're interested in getting more workout tips from me or nutrition tips, and maybe I can just do interlude podcast for something like that, send me a note on social media, post it, but wherever you see this, whether it's Instagram or TikTok or Facebook, put a note in there. Hey, I'd like to have more of these type of things, because I'm open as to the format, but we don't have to do interview type things here. Last thing, call to action, please leave a review if you have not already. It takes 30 seconds. Pause this, or don't pause it. Go get it done. I read every one. It matters. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoy this episode.
So say it again for us.
Demont.
Okay. You work with House of Hypertrophy. Welcome to Chasing Energy today. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing well. Tell us where you're coming from.
London, England.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And how's the weather out there?
Right now, it's been sunny for the past few days, but currently it's pretty cloudy, to be honest. And it's kind of cold today, actually. First time wearing a jumper for a while.
First time what?
First time I'm wearing a jumper for quite a while, because it's quite cold today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that like a water?
Oh, a jumper
water
is
shield?
like a, what do you call it in America? I don't know, this is what we call a jumper. It's thicker, and you put it over a t-shirt.
Oh, okay. Like a sweater?
A sweater, yeah, that's what you call it in America. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't know if it was we have they're called windbreakers, which is like when it's drizzly or it's very thin, but you just throw it over to keep yourself from the water.
Oh yeah.
Like that. Yeah. Very nice. So I'm really happy you're here today. I read some of your work, House of Hypertrophy, which you published to Medium. You also have a book, if you want to mention the name of that book.
Yeah, so it's The Science of Training for Muscle Growth as a Beginner. So the subtitle is The Ultimate Guide for Men and Women of All Ages. So essentially in that book, it's just a complete research summary of all the research behind the training variables that go into making a resistance training program. So I've done my best to summarize everything for pretty much as much demographics as I can, because one of the problems you run across on the internet looking at research articles is they don't particularly mention the demographic they're done on. For example, research conducted on individuals below the age of 50, men, may not necessarily apply to individuals above the age of 50 who are women. So I've done my best to try and shift through that research and figure out what applies to which demographic. And as I to my knowledge, there isn't anything out there like that. So that was my inspiration behind writing a book like that. It's been well received so far. So I just, yeah, that's really it.
Okay, so your niche of sorts is to segment the training to where it's more applicable to a certain demographic.
Yeah, to all demo. Well, I split it down into four: just men below the age
Well,
of 50, women below the age of 50, men above the age of 50, women above the age of 50. Yeah. Hmm.
right, but you could take the same goal of adding muscle, trimming fat, whatever, and then you say this is how you would tweak that program for a woman under 50 versus a man over 50.
Yeah, wherever there's applicable research that suggests there's variation between demographics for the recommendations you would give. Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I can speak to that a little bit. I don't train the same way I did 15 years ago.
Yeah.
It's very different. Namely, warming up in stretching is much more critical to me
Yeah.
now than it was back then. Making time to stretch after a workout now is a non-negotiable, whereas before it was an afterthought.
Yeah.
That's just the twist on my mid-40s training.
Yeah.
So, when you talk about hypertrophy,
Mhm.
and we kind of covered this, but I want you to tell people, you mentioned like cell growth, size, putting on muscle. Can you add any verbiage to what you mean by hypertrophy?
Well, I can get as detailed as you want. So I can try, let me try to put this out as at a broad level first. So your muscles are actually organized in what we call a hierarchical layers, I should say. So within a whole muscle, so you can imagine like the biceps, whatever muscle, you have something called fascicles. Within fascicles are muscle fibers. And what we mean by hypertrophy is the growth of those muscle fibers. Growth of the muscle fibers will increase the size of fascicles, and the increase in the size of fascicles will increase the size of the whole muscle. So it's like a layered
Right.
thing. And so
Yep.
there's different ways muscle fibers can grow. Do you want me to go into this? I can.
No, you can go ahead.
Okay, so within muscle fibers are the contractile units of muscles. What I mean by that is the units of muscles that produce the force they do. We know that muscles produce force when they shorten. There's something called myofibrils. That's the name of where the contractile units are within muscle fibers. And so okay, let me I didn't make that clear. So within muscle fibers are myofibrils, and everything else within the muscle fiber can be considered the sarcoplasm. The sarcoplasm is stuff where like mitochondria, sarcoplasmic proteins are in. So muscle fibers can increase in size via three different ways is what I'm aware of. Myofibrillar hypertrophy is where the myofibrils and sarcoplasm both grow proportionally. So let's say we have a muscle fiber of which 80% of the muscle fiber is comprised of myofibrils. So that means 20% is the sarcoplasm. Let's say that muscle fiber increases in size by 30%. That increased muscle fiber, that larger muscle fiber is still comprised of 80% myofibrils and 20% sarcoplasm. This is achieved because the myofibrils and sarcoplasm both grow proportionally at the same rate. So that's the first way muscle fibers can grow, myofibrillar hypertrophy. The second way is through something called sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Now this is quite an interesting one because this was sort of considered to be a myth or that it couldn't happen. But there's research on it showing that it probably does happen. The exact ways that it happens isn't clear, as in, it's not actually clear if you can train for a specific type of muscle fiber growth at this moment. But anyway, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is where the sarcoplasm grows proportionally more than the myofibrils. So if we take the same example I just gave, let's say we have 80% of a muscle fiber taken up by myofibrils, 20% by sarcoplasm. That muscle fiber increases by 30% in cross-sectional area. But now this muscle fiber is comprised of 30% sarcoplasm and 70% myofibrils. This is achieved, of course, by the sarcoplasm growing disproportionately more than the myofibrils. So the sarcoplasm expanded more than the myofibrils. The final way is myofibrillar packing.
Well, hold on.
Oh, yeah.
What is the advantage of the sarcoplasm growing disproportionately?
This is the question, which I'm not too sure. So the one question is, why would the sarcoplasm grow disproportionately? What at the cellular level occurs? There's some evidence sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is accompanied by a significant increase in glycogen storage. So increased
Yeah.
glycogen control. There's
So
also
runners and
and also sarcoplasmic proteins. So if I had to guess, I'm not certain 100%. Maybe sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is a result of it is a result of the cell needing to produce higher energy. So it's more so to do with energy kinetics, more so than muscle force production. And so going back, the third way muscle fibers can grow is via myofibrillar packing. Myofibrillar packing is where the myofibrils grow disproportionately more than a sarcoplasm. So if we use the same example again, 80% of a muscle fiber is myofibrils, 20% is sarcoplasm. That muscle fiber increases in size by 30%, but now 90% of the muscle fiber is comprised of myofibrils and 10% sarcoplasm. That's because the myofibrils grew disproportionately more than the sarcoplasm. So those are currently the three ways that we speculate a muscle fiber increases in size. And currently in humans is when you see an increase in whole muscle size, it's probably one of those three things that are going on. And I should mention that, of course, a whole muscle contains, it's estimated like hundreds of thousands of fibers. For example, if you take the biceps, which is most people consider not a massive muscle, but it's speculated individuals contain anywhere from 100,000 to 400,000 muscle fibers in the biceps. So you can imagine that it's not necessarily the case that every single muscle fiber will grow the same way. So it's possible you could train for some time, experience the increase in whole muscle size. Some of those muscle fibers within the muscle may have grown via myofibrillar hypertrophy, some via sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and others myofibrillar packing. You just really don't know. So
is this part of why you have these training programs that are always looking to shock the system with something different? Are you trying to target different types of fibers? For example, you have someone who is going from, certain number of sets of 8 reps, right? And they've been doing this for a while. And then you see these programs where they go, now try this drop set routine, or this where you go to the well for like 4 weeks on a particular. Are you trying to target different fibers within the muscle to grow in that? Is that what part of the sort of shocking your routine does?
Probably not, because all of those methods, provided you've trained sufficiently close to failure, you're probably stimulating the vast majority of fibers within a muscle. I would say what people try to do with that is more so avoid plateaus. It's sort of like shock the muscle, expose it to different stimuli, sort of prevent it from getting adaptive to the current thing you're doing. So just keep your...
Okay, but so what you're saying is it's still probably targeting the same type of fiber stimulus, even though it's a shocking it in a different training method.
Yeah, because there's evidence that if you consistently train the same way very long term, so same exercises, same rep range, same sets, there is potentially reason to believe your muscle becomes less responsive to that specific stimuli. As a result, you probably want to vary something in some way. And so that's the sort of logic, I think, that underpins the shocking the muscle idea.
Okay. That's good to know. So I'm actually kind of curious, I'm sure you get this question very regularly, which is, what type of training program, math do you recommend? And you talked about how you look at studies and you look at part of what your specialty is who is this study or this approach identified for? And one of my frustrations is that the vast majority of when they post these articles on, hey, we tried this new training method, it was very effective. It seems like it's almost always on people who are untrained, and that the people who've been training for years and years is kind of an afterthought. And so I kind of want to get your feedback on, what do you consider to be a bullet in the arsenal of triggering hypertrophy in people who have kind of been there, done that, been at this for a few years? Is there a certain number of weeks or a certain number of stimulus in terms of rep range or hypertrophy in terms of how hard you go to the well in training that you find stimulates growth? So do you do 3 weeks of power training where you're doing lower reps versus 3 weeks of higher reps, or whatever? I mean, what are some of the things you have found to help people who've been at this for years to get to the next level?
Well, one of the things is there is a vast degree of, well, there's individuals vary quite a bit. For example, there is some research, there's not a ton, showing that what works best for one individual just simply won't work as well for another individual. For example, recently there was a recent study demonstrating that a person's response to using moderate rep ranges, so 8 to 12 repetitions, isn't
Yeah.
correlated to the muscle growth they experience when they train with higher rep ranges. I think it was around 30 to 35 rep ranges. So what that means
Yeah.
is that if you don't grow well in response to 8 to 12 rep ranges, try 30 to 35 try that rep range, higher rep ranges, because there's a good chance that you become more responsive with that rep range. And a similar logic probably applies to other training variables. So
By the way, you see this with certain athletes. The one that always pops into my head is like Herschel Walker, who
yeah,
is this older guy. He is the physical specimen.
yeah,
And then the guy says, yeah, I don't lift any weights at all. I
yeah.
just do
Wasn't it?
push
It's like his crazy routine is like thousands of push-ups a
a
day
thousand
and
push-ups a day.
sit-ups.
But you think about a lot of people where that there are plenty of people out there who could do all the push-ups and they're never going to get the kind of build that he has.
Yeah,
But that's not to take anything away from him. Just to say that's someone who the high rep range, and he probably has the genetics to support any type of training, by
yeah,
the way. So if he was
yeah,
lifting, he'd probably look great either
yeah.
way. But
Yeah, so going back to what you said about individuals who've been at it for years, you've by that time you've probably accumulated some good knowledge on what works for you and what doesn't. Presumably during that time you would have been keeping training logs, trying to figure out which exercises suit me best, what rep ranges do I tend to respond best to, do I respond better to higher or lower volumes? Is it better for me to go close to fit? Should I go all out? Am I able to handle that and recover from that? Or should I, keep a little bit of reps in reserve?
I think you're giving people too much credit there, and that is that they keep good track of what's going on, and
Yeah.
because I think the first thing I would ask of you is how do you suggest from a basic level that people track their progress? Is it in the amount of strength? Is it necessarily in the amount of how they feel recover? And how do you sort of quantify that type of improvement or recovery? I just started wearing an Aura ring, so I'm actually tracking of all the things I'm interested in. I want to get a better quality of sleep.
Mm.
And so I'm using it specifically to add science to how I sleep better. I'd like to know what are some basic things you can do to see how well your body is responding to a new method of training.
So with hypertrophy training specifically, it's actually very difficult to track progression because hypertrophy isn't very noticeable. It's like you don't wake up the next day and your muscles are 20% bigger. It's a very incremental incremental process. So one of the things that I probably advise is indirectly, if you're getting stronger on your exercises, either via lifting more weights for the same rep range, or performing more reps with the same weights, that's that's an indicator you're progressing resistance training wise. Yeah, as you get more trained, I think there's probably good reason to believe that your ability to progress is reflective of the amount of muscle you're putting on. What I mean by that is
Yeah.
for trained
Yeah.
individuals, if you're getting stronger, it's very difficult. Well, it's sort of difficult to say that strength gain, either via lifting more weights or performing more reps, is a result of neural adaptations or better efficiency with the movement. It's probably more so a fact of your muscle fibers are increasing the number of contractile units they have, which is what we mentioned earlier with the different ways a muscle fiber can grow. And so that in return, the increased number of contractile units you have allows you to lift more weights or perform more repetitions. So that's probably the best metric I can suggest for trained individuals. Are you making progress on your exercises in the form of progressive overload, essentially?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And then what are some advice you have for people to gauge how well you're recovering?
Recovery is actually a difficult one for resistance training specifically because it's markers like heart rate variability don't actually seem to matter too much for resistance training. There was a study done in which somebody's heart rate variability returned within the normal range the next day, but they simply weren't able to move the weights they were the day before at the same velocity, and that was the same day after day. So the best recovery tool is probably somewhat subjective. It's so you can do a mix of subjective and physical indicators. How sore are you? Soreness generally decreases as you continue training, but you can like warm up, do your routine, and just see how you feel. If there's any like deficits, if you're finding a weight you usually warm up with more harder than usual, that's probably a decent indicator that you may not be as well recovered as you wish to be.
Yeah, you're bringing up a good point here, which is when you go to warm up, that should be your assessment of part of your assessment of how hard you're going to go that day. I have and this is on the very, very extreme side, of course, but I have a story where I ran my first 100-miler and beat myself up to pieces. And 4 days after the race, I felt fine. Other than the fact I was sleeping an extra hour to a day, I felt fine. And I went to the gym and grabbed the same pole that I warm up with, and it nearly pinned me to the bench. That's how fatigued my body was, and I had no clue. And I didn't even use my upper body in that race, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, other than hiking poles, I think it took me 30 hours to run it. But the point is, my body was completely fatigued, and I did not realize it until I grabbed that warm-up bar, and I had to put it back. I mean, I had to get help just about to put it back on the thing because my whole body was under repair. I did not realize it at the time. I thought, I'm good to go. This is going to be just a normal day at the gym. So let's talk about longevity a little bit. When you look at, and this is something that I try to help my listeners with, is when you look at sustaining, and this is something I truly struggle with, and that is when I go to strength train, I have a tendency to push too much, thinking that the harder I push, the more benefit I'm going to get. And if I'm not going to say I get injured on a regular basis, but I certainly get close to injured enough on a regular basis that I have to be cautious. So what kind of restraints do you start putting? You mentioned like men under 50 versus over 50, and I would encourage you to add one more niche in there, men under 40 versus over 40. But what kind of, when you talk about effective long-term training, what type of, we would call them governors, like a restrictor plate, what type of restrictions do you encourage people to put in place to where you say, there's not much benefit in going past this point?
Yeah, well, it's really up to the individual because relating to what you just said with regards to training to failure, you don't need to train to failure. The research is, I would say, pretty consistent now in pretty much all demographics, talking men and women below 50, men and women above 50. Training to failure virtually provides it might actually be slightly detrimental for strength, potentially, but I don't want to say that with full confidence. For hypertrophy, that's the case is the same. You don't need to train to failure. So I can go into the numbers just quickly, briefly. So for men and women below the ages of 50, both trained and previously untrained, the research seems to show that stopping 3 reps away from failure is equivalently effective for building muscle to training to failure. So if you
and we would assume it's like a 12 set or 12 rep set in something like that. So you go to say 9 instead of 12.
So yeah, that's one example, and it potentially applies to very high rep ranges too. So if you're performing 30 repetitions, so if you have a load, you can perform a maximum of 30 repetitions with. Performing only 27 should be fine. But one problem with higher rep ranges is it's pretty difficult to actually judge how close to failure you are because
I was going to say
gets in the way.
You're going to be burning. Yeah. You're going to be burning pretty bad on rep number 25.
So it's going to be difficult to judge with that one. For men and
my point there was to say if you're lifting for power and you're only doing 5 reps, you don't need to keep 3 reps in the tank because then you'd just be doing 2.
Yeah.
But if you're doing, you would probably do 4 out of 5 or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. So going back, men and women above the ages of 50, we quantify this slightly different. It seems that performing 50% of the maximum repetitions you can with a given load is sufficient. So if we use the 12 the 12 rep example, you have a load you can perform a maximum of 12 repetitions with. Only performing 6 seems to be sufficient for stimulating hypertrophy and strength. So in that regard, if that saves you a bit in the tank, you find it much easier to train away from failure. It's more motivating, and you find that you can recover easier, which is probably going to be the case for everybody. It seems smart to go down that route in the long term.
Yeah, you're kind of hinting at the point I was hoping to get to, which was this is coming from someone who's been training. I wouldn't say poorly, but certainly ineffectively in some respect for a while. But the value of leaving a few reps in the tank isn't that obvious on the day you're doing it. It's when you've been going to the well with your workouts 2-3 weeks in a row that you start to see the effects of compounding where you're like, I just don't have the energy to go back in the gym, or when I'm going to go to the gym, but the results aren't getting better. All that to say, it's more important, at least to me now, to say I'm not going to miss a workout, and certainly not 2 or 3 over a period of a month, versus I'm going to give my absolute all to every workout, which is more or less what the culture's been trained. I mean, when people think, I'm a runner, or I was a runner, and people are trained to think, well, when you go to run, you put on, that eye of the tiger or something, and then you run as hard as you can, and then you finish your workout and you've got your adrenaline pumping. And I knew even then that going to the well and running as hard as you can is a very terrible idea to do on a consistent basis. It's certainly if you're new to running, because then you're just rolling the injury dice. But from a hypertrophy perspective of strength training, I don't think it's that obvious, because the effects are a little more delayed and prolonged in terms of what's going to happen to you in the effects in terms of being improved. We picture the guy or the girl who has, 1 rep left in the tank, and they're getting spotted and barely getting that one, and they go, that's where the benefit is, right there. But that's not actually the case. For what I'm hearing from you and what I've heard from other health science professionals is you're kind of doing yourself a disservice on that stuff. So when people, you look on Instagram, or you look on how they got this actor in shape for this movie, you see a lot of, well, you do like as many as you can of this butterfly set, dumbbell bench press, then you drop that, and then you go straight into dips, and then you drop that and you do as many push-ups as you can. What is the logic and approach there of implementing something like that?
Yeah. So you can train to failure, and you can do drop sets as where you go to failure, lower the weight. Drop sets are particularly going to be substantially more fatiguing than just keeping a few reps in reserve with a single set.
I don't think anybody's going to argue that point. Anyone who's ever done a drop set you certainly, if you do it with your legs, you're going to be completely shot.
Well, here's the thing. If you're training not a substantial amount of times per week, if you have a limited time to train per week because you're busy with other stuff, whatever, it's entirely possible, I think, for you to get in the gym 1 or 2 times a week and pretty much go all out on what you do and be fine. And so that's a viable method to do. But
that's an important distinction to make. Yeah. There's a big difference between going all out 4 days a week and going all out 2 days a week.
Yeah, it depends on how you structure it.
That's a huge difference. Yeah.
So,
I mean, if you're hitting half your muscle groups and going to the well on a Monday, and half your muscle groups on a Thursday going to the well, I could see somebody sustaining that.
Yeah.
And saying, okay, well, I'm going to be a little bit tired the next day, but I only do this so often. My concern is when a lot of men go, well, I just do 1 muscle group a day. I do 5 days a week, and I go to the well on that particular day. That's where I think you're getting into that area of where the burn isn't necessarily serving you.
Yeah. I agree.
So what about, I know most of your writing is on, sets and reps and things like that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about diversity of exercises, because some of the science that I've seen says having 3 approximately three different exercises per each muscle group is ideal, as opposed to the people who just bench or just do squats, to sort of get stimulus and growth. Have you found that to be the case?
Yeah, this is actually something that I figured out. Well, not figured out. I saw the research in the last year, and it pretty much opened a door that I didn't realize existed, insofar as there's evidence. Well, there's pretty much there's a good amount of evidence demonstrating that a muscle does not grow uniformly in response to a single exercise. For example, if you take the biceps and you only train barbell biceps curl, the upper portion of that muscle, the middle portion of that muscle, and the lower portion of that muscle, so the biceps, do not necessarily grow uniformly. And what we are seeing with the research is that different exercises that vary in some way for the same muscle group, be it the angle used, your hand grip width or whatnot,
Yeah.
probably hit different regions of that muscle. Thus,
Mm-hmm.
collectively performing those exercises for that muscle induces much more regional hypertrophy. That's the term we give it in the research. So, going back to your example with the squats only train the three vasti muscles of the quadriceps. So the vastus medialis, the vastus intermedius, and the vastus lateralis. They very minimally hit the rectus femoris. The rectus femoris is the middle part of your quadriceps. It's quite a big muscle. For that muscle, leg extensions seem to do very well at growing that muscle. So the take home here is that for every single one of your muscle groups, performing probably 2 to 4 different exercises that vary in some way is going to probably grow each of your muscles overall more uniformly, as opposed to just performing one exercise which grows only one region the most. So exercise variety is important.
Okay, so this ties into a follow-up question, which would be, when you think of exercise variety, the way that I try to implement what you just said is, for example, on, say, chest day, I do the TRX straps, then I do the incline bench press, and then later in the week, and this is what I'm trying to get at, I have a second chest day where chest is sort of like secondary, and I do dips on those days. So my thought there is, one way to add variation, as well as, and this is something we haven't necessarily discussed, the science that I've read says hitting a muscle twice a week or 2 days a week is much better than 1 day a week as far as training and hypertrophy. Have you found that to be?
This depends, I think. It depends partially. Well, no, I think the dependent factor is how much sets are you performing for that muscle. For example,
that's a good point. So the goal is what, 10 to 20 sets a week for growth?
I would say that's a good range. If you're on the lower side on the 10 sets, the 10 weekly sets for a muscle, it's possible you could experience perfectly fine hypertrophy by performing all those 10 sets in a single session. So the classic bro splits, where you train each muscle only once a day, that's probably viable for low volumes. Well, low volumes is what I mean by 10 weekly sets, because as for volumes higher than that, the research actually isn't clear. A lot of people have proposed that it's probably better to divide that volume across more days per week, which is what you're saying. So training a muscle twice.
Yeah, it's something like 10 during that main muscle day, and then 5 on the secondary muscle day.
Yeah,
so I would do like 5 sets.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. The research on training frequency isn't all that clear, and I think some people paint it out to be more clearer than it actually is. Specifically, the problem is, well, one thing that's clear is that when you're performing 10 weekly sets per muscle group or fewer, training frequency doesn't seem to matter for hypertrophy. Whether you perform those weekly sets across 1, 2, or 3 sessions per week, it doesn't matter so much. The question is, once you get over that 10 weekly sets, so you're pushing 15, 20, is performing all of that volume in a single session for a muscle still viable, or must you start now dividing that volume across more days per week? And so the research on that the research exploring that is currently not that clear. It's a little conflicting.
Yeah, I can kind of see the logic though,
Yeah,
whether the
you can
science backs
100%
this up
see
or
the
not. But the logic is seems that once you've done 10 sets of a particular muscle group in one day, the quality
yeah,
of those sets after
yeah,
10 is going to be very diminished
yeah.
at that
I
point.
agree. Yeah. So from that perspective, spreading that volume out across more days per week is probably going to be what you want to do.
Okay. So let's talk about eccentric training. This is something you mentioned in our
Mm.
discussion earlier about eccentric training is much more aggressive. Talk to me about how this is sort of I think eccentric training is kind of a neglected aspect of training. So tell us a little bit about how people can benefit from eccentric training.
So eccentric training's an interesting one insofar as you don't really see it much. I didn't even know it existed until I started reading research talking about eccentric overload. Whenever I heard eccentric training, I just thought they meant lowering the weight slower in any given conventional exercise. So with a biceps curl, you curl it up, and then I thought eccentric training was just lowering it very slowly. But that's not the case. There are machines and equipment out there designed to overload the eccentric phase of an exercise. So for anybody that doesn't know, the eccentric phase of any given exercise is just the lowering phase. It's where the muscle is producing force while lengthening. So with the biceps example, there exist machines out there where you simply just lower it, but the machine induces a supra-concentric forces. So your muscle can produce. I didn't describe that well. Let me go back. Your muscles can produce more forces eccentrically than it can concentrically. So you can lower weights that you can't lift. So with a biceps curl, it's like you could lower a weight above 100% of your one rep max. And
I can
so
see that.
that's
Yeah.
what eccentric
Yeah.
training is. It's you're training with loads that you can't actually lift, but you're just training the lowering phase of a movement. And like I said, there are machines and stuff specifically out there designed to accomplish that. Insofar as the benefits, for hypertrophy, it's not currently clear if eccentric overload training of any type provides more hypertrophy. There was a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a study that combines the results of numerous studies, and on the whole, increases in muscle size were not statistically different between concentric and eccentric only training. However, the percentages slightly did seem to favor eccentric training. It was like 10% growth by eccentric training and like 6 to 7% by concentric only training. So I think it's possible eccentric training could potentially produce more muscle growth. But what I will say that probably is more clear from the research is that eccentric training might produce a slightly different, eccentric training might produce a different type of muscle growth to concentric training. What I mean by that is that eccentric training seems to increase the length of fascicles within muscles. So if we return to what I said earlier, I said within a whole muscle are fascicles, within fascicles are muscle fibers. Eccentric training seems to increase the length of fascicles, and presumably that's driven by an increase in muscle fiber length. Stuff like that seems to probably be beneficial for people who need to produce high amounts of power, probably
Yeah. I was
sprinters
going to
and stuff.
say gymnasts, high jumpers,
Yeah.
where you have the length. I think the knees over toes guy, he kind of preaches strength and elasticity, getting that sort of long, powerful tendons.
Yeah, so eccentric training seems to produce that specifically more so than normal training. And one other thing that I just remembered is that insofar as normal hypertrophy, increase in cross-sectional area, it seems eccentric only training produces more hypertrophy of the distal part of a muscle, which is the lower part of a muscle, whereas concentric training primarily seems to grow the middle part of a muscle. So what I mean by distal is the lower part. So with the biceps, concentric only training probably grows the middle portion of that biceps more, an increase in cross-sectional area of that zone, whereas eccentric training probably grows the more lower part of the biceps. So that's the interesting thing about eccentric only training, and that probably one potential implication of that is you wonder if combining eccentric only training with conventional resistance training overall makes you build more muscle via more regional hypertrophy.
Yeah, the way that, and this may be a misapplication, but the way that I think of this is you look at the arms of somebody who either makes dough all day or moves UPS boxes or something, and they have this development
Yeah, I think I know what you
that
mean.
goes from all the way from their wrist all the way to the shoulder, versus someone who lifts in the gym primarily, and their development is very different. It's focused in certain areas,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, makes sense.
So I can see someone who, for example, like I said, just spends the entire day pulling that dough, and then the person who's just moving boxes all day, how they develop that eccentric training is probably as much of their training as anything else, and that the development is almost completely thorough. In fact, when you see somebody with super strong forearms, I think half the time it's not because they're lifting or because they lift weights at all. It's because they're in some type of occupation or lifestyle where they have to use it on a very frequent basis.
Quite possible.
You think of, I mean, growing up as a kid, Popeye.
Yeah.
I mean, all his I mean, he's a cartoon, of course, but they were more focused on the development of his forearms than anything. But I would assume that sailors back then worked with ropes and things like that, and those probably somewhat of the basis of his strength. So we've talked about that. Talk to me a little bit about the repeated power effect. You mentioned about
Yeah, so when I mentioned it's the repeated bout effect.
Bout.
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 B-O-U-T.
Okay. Yeah,
Repeated
this is the
bout.
part that I misspelled on our notes.
Yeah.
Okay. So talk to me about the repeated bout effect.
So the repeated bout effect is a very interesting phenomena where your muscles essentially, your muscles adapt in a way that they become resilient to muscle damage. So everybody's probably had the experience of either you've never exercised before and you just started to exercise, or you've taken a break and coming back from your break, you start training. You experience severe muscle soreness the next day. Your muscles are extremely sore, it's hard to move and whatnot. Now, it's not actually clear if that soreness is actually driven by muscle damage. They tend to be associated, but whether the events are actually causative isn't actually clear. But nevertheless, what the repeated bout effect is that as you continue to perform the same exercise over and over again, your body becomes resilient such that the amount of muscle damage produced becomes less. So one of the implications of that is that your recovery essentially increases over time. And so, again, people have probably experienced this. Over time, they experience less soreness. And this is probably driven by the adaptations that are the repeated bout effect. At the muscle level, it's not particularly clear at this time what specifically is going on that makes your muscles resilient to damage. But we have enough evidence that demonstrates that all of the indices of recovery, they're enhanced after repeated exercise of the same type.
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea there being your body knows how to handle that particular type and spot of inflammation because you're doing it. For example, hill repeats. If you're a runner in hill repeats, when you first start into hill repeats, it's a 2-day recovery process, and then it becomes a 1-day process after an established amount of time. Or at least that's how it feels.
Yeah, one thing is that we didn't really know to what extent the repeated bout effect can occur. Is it unlimited? For example, could you perform very, very high damaging muscle exercise, and to what extent can your body adapt to that such that eventually all damage ceases to occur? And there was one study last year demonstrating that. So going back to eccentric training, one of the things with eccentric training is it produces substantially more muscle damage initially than concentric or conventional resistance training.
Yes.
And so there was a study done in which they had either subjects perform 5 sets of 15 maximal eccentric contractions or 5 sets of 15 concentric maximal contractions, and the subjects in both groups trained once per week for 10 weeks. As you'd expect in the first week, these were maximal contractions, so 15 reps, 5 sets of 15 maximal eccentric contractions is an absolute killer. That took them, I think their soreness lasted for like 5 days. Their range.
Okay, hold on. 5 sets of 15 or 5 sets of 50?
15, 1-5.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, but these were maximum. They were done on something called the isokinetic dynamometer. So each of those 15 repetitions were maximal eccentric forces. And so that was pretty intense. And so in the first week, soreness, damage, range of motion was all significantly reduced with the subjects training eccentrically versus the subjects training concentrically. But by the 10th week, neither group were experiencing much damage or soreness the next day after the training session. What that tells us is that the repeated bout effect seems to be pretty robust. The amount of adaptations that your body can produce to become resilient to damage is quite big. So yeah, that was a pretty interesting study, because before that, we weren't sure of the magnitude the repeated bout effect could occur.
And in that study, maybe you said this and I missed it, but in that study, did they switch them from eccentric to concentric at any point, or did they stay with the same one through the
No,
entire
all
thing?
subjects were. So there was two groups, and those were the groups. So they didn't. Neither subject switched.
That to me, that would have been the logical thing, though. Switch them to the other group and see how sore they get, and
Oh,
if it
after
was
the
the
study.
same,
Oh, right,
yeah.
yeah. Oh, okay,
Well,
I see what you
yeah,
mean.
and then say, okay, well, you're really good at eccentric now,
Hmm.
and you're recovering quickly. Let's switch you to concentric and see if your soreness is the same
Yeah,
at what
I
they
see what you mean. But I
experienced.
presumably, because concentric training produces very little damage and soreness, and presumably the subjects training eccentrically would have had the adaptations already, and it was the same exercise. So you presume that the damage produced by concentric training wouldn't have been that much. But like you said, it would have been interesting to test that.
I generally don't get very sore at all,
Really?
and even when I try to, well, I'm give me a grain of salt there. I don't. I've been doing this stuff for a while,
Mm.
but what I was going to say was, trust me, there's some humility coming here. Um, uh, I am. I normally do my routine where I told you where I do the TRX
Mm.
straps, and then which is more of a decline press, and then I go to the bench and do incline press, and then change the things. Well, I started adding in dips on the cross training day, and the first day that I did those dips, which I was doing them to failure, but the next day was a soreness in my chest
Mm.
that I had not had in quite some time, and I even thought to myself, I didn't realize it at the time that I was real that they were that difficult, but I guess it was just the difference in stimulus, and it is more of an eccentric exercise, by the way. A dip is I go down a
Yeah.
little slower. It's easier to get up almost on a dip than it is to go down with a very regulated
Hmm.
fashion. But the point there being, switching that up and just adding in that one dynamic gave me quite a little bit of fatigue that I had not
Yeah, so
experienced in a
that's one
while.
point about the repeated bout effect. It's probably specific to the exercises you train. So when you
Mhm.
do perform a completely new exercise, that is
Yeah.
most likely going to produce a lot of fatigue and soreness the next day.
Well, let's tie this into running. I I'm starting back to running. I don't. I used to run a lot.
Hmm.
I don't. I did, and then I had some injuries and stuff. And now I'm just enjoying running as a hobby. So I kind of cap it at about 5 miles. But what I was going to say was, uh, I try. This is the one time where I'm trying to practice what I preach and starting in very slow, not going to the well, not running hard. So for the first month, it was all zone two,
Mm.
meaning I'm not quite sure what my cap is on my zone 2, but my self-regulated thing is if my heart rate gets to 140, I go into a walk until it drops, and then I stay. Okay, well, the point there is, um, for a month, I ran nothing but zone 2, and as soon as I tried to start doing intervals, it was like a completely different
Yeah.
exercise for me. My feet had to learn how to move fast again. My heart rate in terms of what it was getting up to during those intervals was a far, far, far cry. I mean, it was almost like legs versus chest day. It was that much of a difference
Yeah.
for me in terms of running fast versus running at a very regulated fashion. And I think that's why you see there's really no way for that I've heard people preach that you can achieve this sort of massive amount of fitness. Uh, Maffetone, Phil Maffetone is the one who sort of preached zone 2 is the way to be an elite athlete. And it is the vast majority of the training, but what I would argue is that I don't know of any elite athletes who do not do intervals,
Hmm.
that who don't in some capacity incorporate these hard stimulus that really shock the system and push the heart up to
Yeah.
your max heart rate. Um, Nutritionally, is there any insights that you've come across lately that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so nutrition is one aspect that I have very little knowledge on, because it's not an
Hmm.
area that I spend much time researching. primarily it's just the training literature is what I dive into. It's what I'm most interested in. The
Yeah.
nutrition aspect doesn't overly interest me. It's too much.
Okay. Um, I like that. Know your knowledge and
Hmm.
all those things. And I'm going to. I had a Sherry Edwards on the podcast,
Hmm.
which was she has a website called Macros and Micros where she coaches, and so I'm trying to get a little bit of give people the full picture. But this was a great picture on training. Can you talk to me about where people can find you and where they can learn more about what it is you're writing?
Yeah, so you can find me on a variety of platforms. I make videos, animated videos on YouTube. My channel name is just House of Hypertrophy. If you just search that up on
Mhm.
YouTube, you'd find it. You can find my website, which is just houseofhypertrophy.com. You can also find me on Instagram, which is at House of Hypertrophy, Twitter at House of Hypertrophy. And I also write articles on Medium. So if you type in Medium and you can type in my name,
Which is where I found it. Yeah,
yeah,
great articles,
yeah,
fantastic.
thank you for
Yeah.
that. You can type in Medium and you can type in my first name, which is Dimant, which is Dhimant. So those are all the current platforms that I produce content on.
Dimon, this has been a real learning experience for me. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. And I look forward to connecting with you again in the future. Talk about what maybe 6 months from now, what have you learned in the last 6 months that you can sort of add in there? Like yourself, I'm always looking at the studies
Hmm.
and going, what is science teaching us about how the body is adapting and learning? And and what can we change about tweak our approach specifically for my audience? How do you start tweaking that approach as your life changes? So, um, I'll end on this note and say, you talked about the variables of someone over 50 versus under 50 and how you look at how those variables change. Well, a big part of that is what I try to teach people is once you have children, the amount of time you have to train changes dramatically,
Hmm.
and then the external stressors that you have, say you're in your career when you get into your 40s versus your 20s. Um, how do you manage your training to where it doesn't take away to where you're just spent when you're at your job or you don't have the energy to do both? And where is it beneficial to where you go, there are certain days where I need to have a stress outlet. Otherwise, like we talked about the compounding effect to where it starts to interfere with your social life and your career and things like that. So, right sizing the training days for when your external factors, your social commitments and your career commitments, that's something where I've actually been kind of diplomatic with myself and saying, for example, if I run intervals, I am not a good thinker that day. I'm much more mellow. I'm more laid back, but I'm not the kind of person who would sit down at a table and go, let me show you a brainstorming
Hmm.
plan for how I'm going to do this. Strength training, fine. I
Hmm.
can I can do 45 minutes of strength training, pop in there and do that. But intervals are a day where my children love me because I'm much more easy to get along with, laid back. I'm much more likely to say, let's just chill and watch a movie tonight than constantly saying, let's go to the park again or whatever. So we'll keep in touch on that, and
Hmm.
I really want to encourage listeners. I'm going to put all the links to your
Awesome.
different variety of formats. You're very Renaissance man in terms of your formats, man. I need to learn from you. I've really been lazy as to where I post and how I post, but you've got it all from Twitter to YouTube, and you've got all your bases covered.
Yeah.
And part of why I was so anxious to connect with you was when you read articles on Medium, 90% of the time it's clear that this person is putting together 2 sentences of content and stretching it out into a page and a half
I
to
know what
get
you
you
mean.
to click.
Yeah.
And in your case, it was a book of content that was consolidated to about 10 pages. And I was sitting there going, I wish I'd have read an article like this when I started my weight training, and it would have saved me a lot of time and
No, I
effort.
appreciate that.
Yeah, man. Well, it's from the heart, and I look forward to connecting with you
For
again
sure.
soon.